Okay, thank you, Lori. Can you hear me or?
Perfect.
Okay, and is the screen is shared and everything's ready to go or?
You're not sharing your screen yet.
Okay, sorry. Let me,
That's okay.
that's,
Perfect.
okay, perfect. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Lori, for inviting me to deliver this presentation, especially because I'm not in the field that all of you are in. I'm a political scientist, as Lori said, and my research focuses in the areas of American politics, although now I'm moving more in a global direction. But also my research is in mainly in the area of animal advocacy. It's a particular passion for me, a personal passion for me, and about 10 years ago or so, I started building it into my actual research agenda. So just a little bit of very brief biographical information. As Lori said, I'm Dr. Stephen Tauber, and I got my PhD in government from the University of Virginia in 1995, and ever since then I've been teaching here at the University of South Florida in Tampa, where yes, it has been an unseasonably warm 80 degrees, although next week we're going to be going into what we consider cold, which will be in the highs in the mid 50s. So anyway, on animal advocacy, I've published a number of articles and book chapters, and most notably my book, 2016 book with Routledge, Navigating the Jungle, which explores sort of strategies that the animal advocacy movement uses, particularly in the area of the law. And now I'm focusing much more on a global level. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the kind of philosophies of animal welfare and animal rights and how they specifically pertain to animal-assisted therapies. And so most of my presentation will be focusing on philosophy as well as political activity. And then the last part of the presentation, I'm going to address a little bit kind of going forward where animal-assisted therapy as a field and some of the animal rights issues and controversies, where there's conflict, where there's areas of cooperation, and further areas where those of you who are interested in learning more about animal advocacy and the animal rights movement can look at. And one quick point I want to make before I get into the presentation is I am using this AAT, animal-assisted therapy. It's a shorthand for animal-assisted therapy, animal-assisted intervention, emotional support animals. I wanted to just use something relatively easily identifiable, but I don't want to create the impression that I'm just focusing on one narrow aspect of what all of you do. And so where I want to start is sort of what the extant literature is on AAT and animal well-being, and then kind of what the gap is there and how I think my presentation can fill the gap and complement some of this existing literature. So for the most part, there's limited academic studies on AAT's impact on animals. The vast majority of the research, and I did, especially after agreeing to do the presentation, a pretty extensive literature review, the vast majority obviously focuses on how AAT affects the human patients because it's a human-oriented field, and that's certainly understandable. In 1991, there was a groundbreaking article in Anthrozoos called Ethical Issues in AAT, authored by Ian Nuzzi and Rowan. And this was one of the first scholarly studies that examined how the therapy actually influences the animals. And they surveyed a number of AAT professionals, and they, as sort of a theoretical matter, kind of likened the treatment of AAT animals to companion animals. Obviously, there's considerable overlap there, using dogs and horses. And they ultimately concluded that most animals fare well, but they did identify some examples of mistreatment. They were especially concerned about using wild animals that are not appropriate for interacting with humans. They also issued a call for more institutional guidelines and development. And so again, this is 30 years ago. This was really a groundbreaking article. And subsequently, there's been a number of other studies, and this is by no means meant to be an exhaustive list. It's just a kind of what I see as some of the leading studies. So in 2006, Sachi Zamir published an article called The Moral Basis of AAT, and he published it in the Journal Society of Animals, which I've published in that journal myself. And he takes a more kind of philosophical or ethical approach to the use of animals in AAT. And he's going to identify some areas of concerns and areas where they're not concerns. And I'll get to that very, very briefly in a minute. But one of the key sort of theoretical approaches Zamir takes is this distinction between use and exploitation. And so obviously, in AAT, animals are used for humans, but as Zamir explains, there's nothing wrong with using one being using another. People use each other all the time. You do a favor for somebody, that you're essentially being used by that person. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as there's this understanding that both parties are sort of at equal level and that there's going to be some reciprocation. Whereas exploitation is a idea where there's a kind of permanent status where the powerful is always dominating the less powerful for the benefit of the powerful without any concern about the non-powerful, which would be in this case the animal. And based on this model, Zamir makes a number of conclusions, and one of the conclusions he makes is that using in dogs and horses in AAT is perfectly acceptable. The animals benefit. In fact, many of those animals, he argues, wouldn't be in existence if it wasn't for AAT. But then he argues use of other animals, liminal and wild animals, would not be acceptable. There's no benefit to those animals, and it's not morally acceptable. The following year, Hatch had a piece as well that kind of expanded on Iannucci and Rowan, which not only used structured interviews with professionals, but also she engaged in her own participant observation of AAT. And then she also addresses a number of areas of concern. Another important piece is Lori Marino. In 2012, she's well-known, a dolphin biologist, and she published an article again in Anthrozoos called The View from All Fours, a look at animal-assisted activity programs from the animal's perspective. And actually, she had published a long series of articles co-authored with other scholars going back several years before this piece came out. And this is essentially a meta-analysis. She doesn't do her own research per se, but sort of kind of collects the existing studies that have already been published. And while she's looking at the benefits of using research, of using animals in therapy, she basically finds that the studies that have been out there are methodologically flawed and not really very conclusive. And at best, she argues the benefits from these therapies are modest. And the reason she makes this argument, and she's very clear in the article, is that the benefits being modest is very important when considering whether we should use or whether you should use AAT with in terms of live animals. If the benefits aren't as clear as people might assume, then it might be better not to use some of the live animals. And then also the Handbook on Animal-Assisted Therapy, there are multiple editions. I looked at the 2019 edition. There was a chapter on animal welfare. It was very technical, focusing on how to assess welfare, whether you do what some of the other scholars did, like looking at the actual practitioners and what their views are, or actually, for example, looking at cortisol levels in some of the therapy dogs. And then there was a very thorough discussion there of how the animals should be treated with even with pictures. And I found it to be very interesting. And again, this is just a quick, kind of summary. It's not meant to be exhaustive. So if anyone has any publications in here that I missed, I apologize in advance. Also, there's been institutional efforts in animal welfare. So the International Association of Human-Animal Interaction Organizations published the 1998 Prague Declaration. I'm sure you're all, as members of this, are familiar with it. And it lists a series, and I have the links here. People can get to them. I was considering doing the presentation, but I think I might just move forward without doing that. But you can see these links yourself. It's a series of statements that are there to preserve the animal welfare, so only domesticated animals can be used, safeguards have to be put in place, the ensuring basic standards. Then also this organization in 2014 and then updated in 2018, the link here is the 2018 update, the IAHA white paper, which is a longer extension of a series of standards that need to be in place for treating animals that are used in therapy, make sure that they're going to be well treated. And then also there's in Purdue University has at the vet school has the Center for the Human-Animal Bond. And there are several classes there that actually deal with animal welfare for people that might be in veterinary school for, especially for therapy issues. And then there's Pet Partners, which used to be called the Delta Society. It has a position statement, and that's the main, organization for using pets in therapy situations and emotional support. And again, it's a series of key points that should be understood when using animals in a therapy situation. And so overall, this is what I've concluded from the extant literature. First of all, the research is clearly evidence-based. It's based in science. It's based in either social science and surveys or participant observation or actual physical science. And I think the conclusion is that animal welfare is largely preserved. Clearly, they identify problems or potential problems. Mistreatment and neglect of the animals, obviously, physical contact with humans to make sure, in a therapy situation that the patient doesn't harm the animal, whether even intentionally or unintentionally. The working environment of the animals, that they're not overworked, that the temperature in the facility is something that's comfortable for the animal, that the animal's well fed, gets enough rest and water, working conditions, they're not overworked, they get rest just like humans would in any working situation. They address the handler's responsibilities, that the handler needs to make sure that they're taking care of the animals. And then question on types of animals, which I'll talk a little more about that, particularly on some of the concerns people have expressed about breeding, but certainly the idea that only animals that can withstand contact with humans, generally dogs, horses, should be appropriate, whereas a wild animal, there's the famous case with emotional support alligator, obviously is one that's not appropriate. And so this is where I see the current research. One of the gaps I see in the research is that there's very limited discussion of the philosophical backgrounds of animal welfare and animal rights. In fact, a lot of the discussions that I've come across in this research kind of lumps the two together. Even Zamir, who is more of an animal rights advocate than a therapist or in the field of therapy, lumps the two together. And even within the two concepts of animal welfare and animal rights, which I'll get into in considerable detail through the presentation, even within those two concepts, the sides are not monolithic, particularly in the animal rights. And I know a lot of you have maybe experienced or had conflict with people in the animal rights movement. And I think it's important to understand that even the philosophical background and the political activities of animal rights is not a uniform. There are a spectrum of views in this this camp of animal rights and animal welfare as well. And so this presentation is going to fill that gap. It's meant as a complement to the extant literature, certainly not intending to replace it. I think the evidence-based literature is crucial. I'll provide a detailed discussion of these philosophies. I'll explore the implications for AAT and provide some strategies for AAT professionals interested in animal advocacy. So let's first start with the philosophical arguments and political activities concerning the status of animals. So before the 19th century, the dominant view, the overwhelming view when it comes to animals was that humans had every right to dominate animals. We could do whatever we wanted with them. And the reason is twofold. Animals lack language and they lack rationality. So for a lot of Western philosophy, and this is strictly going to focus on Western philosophy, it's not to privilege Western over non-Western philosophies, but just to kind of give the presentation a more narrow focus. So in Western philosophy, key aspects for what defines a political person or a person that's deserving of justice are the ability to communicate and the ability to reason. And animals lack, they believe, both. Now, obviously we'll cover later, we know now that that's not really necessarily the case. It's not a distinction, it's more of a degree of language and reason. But the idea in the most of this pre-19th century world is that animals are, not they can't think, they can't speak. We can do what we want with them, and it led to extensive cruelty to animals that was often promoted by a lot of these philosophers. A lot of these Western philosophers that we often regard as people who expanded a more humanist philosophy. And this goes across these traditions. So in the ancient world, you had Aristotle, as a picture there on the top. Aristotle believed that animals existed solely for the purpose of humans. And if the animals suffered, that's too bad, because our job is to do what we want with them, eat them, use them for clothes, use them for work and things like that. Even in the Middle Ages, the leading Christian thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Augustine believed that animals not only even are not an object of justice, they're not even an object of charity. We don't even owe charity to animals because, again, they're dumb, they can't speak, they don't matter. And what's even amazing here is even in the Enlightenment, which we consider a philosophical period that's crucial for expanding human progress, and certainly for the founding of the country. A lot when I teach American government, focus on a lot of these philosophies because they're crucial to the Declaration of Independence and our founding. Even there, the idea is that animals are not worthy of justice. So on the bottom here, we have Rene Descartes, one of the premier Enlightenment thinkers. Descartes actually argued animals don't even really feel pain. So even if they're expressing something that looks like it's painful, it doesn't matter. They're not really in pain. They're like machines. He was willing to support some really, what even at the time were considered horrific vivisection practices, dissections on live dogs in medical schools and things like that. Not all Enlightenment philosophers were as cruel to animals as Descartes. But again, they didn't think that animals matter. So even John Locke, who is crucial for the founding of our country, and his focus on natural rights to life, liberty, and property, he thought animals are property, that the owner of the animal has the property right to do what he wants with the animal. He did express some concern about animal cruelty, wanton cruelty against animals, but his concern wasn't so much about the effect on the animals, but what it said about the morality of the individual, of the human inflicting the cruelty. So there were real briefly, some exceptions. In the ancient world, you had some vegetarian philosophers, Pythagoras and Porphyry. In the Middle Ages, St. Francis of Assisi is a patron saint of animals and the environment, certainly believed we owed a debt of charity and kindness to animals. In the Enlightenment, you had Humphrey Primat and Michel de Montaigne, who argued for some charity towards animals and respect of animals, because they do exhibit some qualities that humans do, like friendship and compassion and some emotions. But it's really when we get to the philosophies of animal welfare in the 19th century that we begin as Western philosophy to focus on the interests of animals. And the key thinker here is Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham is a 18th, 19th century utilitarian. And so utilitarianism as a philosophy it's known as a consequentialist philosophy. All that really matters are the results or the consequences, hence the name consequentialist. And so for utilitarian, they don't care as much about what somebody's intents are. It's just what the results are. And for Bentham, as a matter of policy or political science, so to speak, the basic rule is that whatever policy or act is being considered, calculate all the benefits, calculate the costs, and if the benefits outweigh the costs, then you go with that policy. If not, then you don't. So unlike, for example, like John Locke, Bentham completely rejected the concept of rights. In fact, there's a quote, he said, natural rights, he called it nonsense upon stilts. This fake, elevated idea that you have a natural right. So think, for example, like freedom of speech. We think of that as our right. We have a right to say what we want as part of being an American citizen or a citizen of some other country. For Bentham, he didn't oppose freedom of speech necessarily, but his argument would be, well, what's the benefit of letting somebody speak a specific idea versus the harm that would come to that person if he or she's punished for it? And so Bentham was, even though it seems like a harsh philosophy, actually engaged in considerable political social reform. So, for example, in the area of penal reform, he argued that the job of punishing somebody for a crime isn't appropriate. So somebody commits robbery, we don't punish them out of vengeance or retribution. The idea is to incapacitate them because they're obviously causing harm by engaging in robbery, and hopefully rehabilitate them so that instead of being a negative asset in society, they're a negative draw in society, they're a positive asset in society. And there are many utilitarians in the 18th, 19th century. John Stuart Mill, Bentham is leading ones. But what Bentham's important is because he explicitly incorporates animal suffering into this calculus of benefits and costs. The term he actually uses is pleasure and pain. And so for the first time, animal suffering is really something that is central in a philosophy. You count that in the negative effects of a policy. So if there's some farming, how to farm and engage in agriculture, the idea should be, yes, there's certain benefits to using animals in agriculture, but we also must count those costs. And the idea that the animals matter is kind of revolutionary at the time. And there's a famous quote that Bentham has in response to those who say animals can't speak, they can't think, so they don't matter. And Bentham wrote, the question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? So their suffering matters. Now, again, it's important to understand as a utilitarian, Bentham doesn't argue that we shouldn't use animals at all. He abided to killing and harming of animals in some circumstances, but only if the benefits outweigh those costs. But again, the idea of just including them in the cost is revolutionary. And this starts the kind of welfarist view. The philosophical basis of the welfarist view is really this utilitarian view that consequences are really what matters. And probably the most famous contemporary welfarist is Peter Singer. And he wrote in 1975 a groundbreaking book called Animal Liberation, A New Ethics for Treatment of Animals, a first edition copy there. And we'll talk about in a minute about the effects of this book, because it's obviously important, and most of you are, I'm sure, familiar with it. But the important part is not so much the last chapters, but for a philosophical sense, the first chapter is that Singer outlines his utilitarian philosophy. And he specifically starts with Bentham and explains how he's going to sort of advance Bentham, bring him, modernize him into the kind of mid-late 20th century. And one of the areas he changes a little bit with Bentham is he also focuses a little more on individual ethics as well as policy. But again, the idea here is ultimately everything should be done on a calculation of benefits versus costs. And for Singer, he's relying specifically on this concept. He's not the person who coined the term, but he uses it extensively, called speciesism. So just like, for example, racism or sexism, in racism, somebody is considered inferior because they're of a different race, or sexism, men would consider women inferior, therefore they can't vote, or something along those lines. Speciesism argues that we shouldn't consider the suffering of animals inferior to the suffering of humans. And so in that level, when counting the costs of a specific action, the animal suffering has to be considered equal to the human suffering. And so Singer focuses on things like use of scientific research, animals in research, and factory farming, and argues, this immense amount of suffering that that the animals experience, that immense amount of suffering needs to be considered, and even more than Bentham would consider, needs to be highly valued as a cost when assessing specific actions. And again, we can't think of it as any less than the suffering that a human would experience undergoing the same things that, let's say, a pig in the slaughterhouse goes through. Whatever that would mean to a person, the fear, the pain, the death, that counts the same as it does as we should count it the same as we would for a pig. But it's important to understand Singer's a utilitarian. He doesn't argue for a blanket opposition to the use of animals necessarily, just base it on sort of what the costs are and what the benefits are. So there's a lot of kind of back and forth that Singer has about whether we should eat mollusks, for example, which are snails or clams or mussels, arguing that they don't feel quite the same pain, so it's not quite as bad as, let's say, eating a pig. And of course, this book is famous because it's really the progenitor of the modern animal advocacy movement. A lot of people would say he was the first sort of animal rights person, and he certainly, I would argue, was a major influence on animal rights. But it's important to be very careful using the term rights, because Singer doesn't believe in rights. He's a utilitarian, and so that puts him in a very different camp. Some other examples of some contemporary welfarists. There's a political scientist in England named Robert Garner, who argues that a kind of abolition of the use of animals, which I'll talk about later in a little bit, the animal rights view, we should completely abolish using animals. He argues that that's just an unattainable goal. It might be great, but we're just never going to convince people in society and certainly the global economy to stop using animals. Therefore, we shouldn't waste our time with that. Instead, what we should do is regulate to improve the lives of animals. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute when I go through the kind of political activities of animal welfare. Another contemporary welfarist is David Favre, who's a professor at Michigan State in animal law. He's a law professor. And instead of focusing on animals' rights per se, he focused on the interest of animals. He envisions sort of a role of guardianship. And this could be important when we look at welfare and AAT, for example, that the person who owns the animal is really that animal's guardian, similar to how a parent is a guardian to a child. Favre also has written about using our tort law to protect animals. Just like in torts, you can have remedies. Let's say there's a plant that's polluting a river and people are getting sick. You could fine the plant, or you can force the plant to stop engaging in that harmful activity. It's not in their criminal law area, it's in torts. And Favre kind of applies that to animals as well. And in fact, Favre argues the fact that animals are property means that they can actually be better protected because we can use the tort system as a way to consider them property and transfer that property to another owner when the animal is being harmed. So kind of overall, summing up animal welfare tenets, again, its basis is in utilitarianism. It does not reject the concept that animals are property. It believes that humans can own property. It believes that animals are instrumental. And by instrumental here, I mean that animals can be a means to an end. And the end can be for humans. So humans can use animals, but again, what's important here is as long as that suffering is limited. So there's a point here that one example is sort of the United Kingdom Farm Animal Welfare Council 5 freedoms. So for all animals, there's these 5 freedoms that they say stand for animal welfare: no hunger or thirst, no discomfort, no pain, injury, or disease. They can express their normal behavior, no fear or distress. But of course, what's important to understand here is that what they are saying is it's okay to farm the animals. It's okay to ultimately kill the animal and have humans consume its meat as long as these conditions are met here. So what are some of the welfarist political actions? And again, we're going to see it's about regulation, not abolition. So one is rescue efforts. So ASPCA, Humane Society, this is the Best Friends. Animal rescue, that's a big role of the animal welfare movement. They fight animal cruelty. So on the left, that's Henry Berg, who's the founder of the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So they, from their inception in the 19th century, have lobbied for stronger animal cruelty statutes. They've lobbied for more stringent sentences. So now, for example, it is wanton animal cruelty is a felony in all 50 states. There's recent legislation about making a felony at the federal level. They highlight specific cases. So on the right here is Michael Vick, who is a leading quarterback whose career didn't officially end, but effectively ended after he served time in prison for engaging in animal fighting and ran a dogfighting ring. As a policy matter, animal welfare has specific policy efforts. The Humane Society of the United States is one of the key lobbyers, and they argue for better treatment for animals used in agriculture and research, relying a lot on the Animal Welfare Act, which has certain levels of standards for pets and including therapy animals, as well as animals used in research. They promote humane farming law. For example, the picture here is from in 2004. We in Florida actually vote on constitutional amendments, and they're really like in the West, like the referendum policy, except for us, it goes in the Constitution. So here we had a case where we banned crating gestating pigs, so that a pig who's pregnant can not be in these conditions and can actually be able to roam a little freer. But again, it didn't ban the consumption and production of pigs, it just banned these certain treatments of them. So when thinking about animal-assisted therapy, I think that there are certain points with animal welfare and welfarism. I think the two coexist very easily. The benefits to humans matters for a welfarist. So for, again, if you're engaging in this utilitarian calculation, the benefits to the humans needs to be in the calculation, as long as, going along with the treatment of the animals. So there is concern for animals on the other side of the utilitarian calculus. So of course, no cruelty or abuse, or concern for overworking the animals, setting standards, monitoring, enforcing, sanctioning, some of the things I've been talking about already. Animal welfare is certainly see this as part of their, important regulations for AAT. But again, they coexist very easily, and there's very little conflict. Now let's look at animal rights philosophies. And here we're going to see there's a surprising diversity of views, although here I think we'll find there's much more conflict between many of the animal rights philosophies and the practice of AAT. So we're going to start unlike the other side. I'm going to start first with some of the basic tenets of animal rights. So they reject the concept that animals are property. Animals are not the property of humans. And that means animals are not instrumental. They don't serve the purposes for humans. Every animal, and in the animal rights view, only serves the purpose for itself. So that means we don't use animals for food, we don't use them for clothing, we don't use them for entertainment, we don't use them for scientific research. And then, of course, the open question that I'll address is, can, under this umbrella of animal rights, can animals be used for therapy? But again, I want to make this point that, and this is important because I think a lot of people, throughout the country and people I've talked with on all sides of this issue, assume that animal rights is this monolithic view, and they associate with certain behaviors that I will address, but I'm going to make the point that they're not, that there's actually a wide diversity in how animal rights philosophers and political activists approach their passion. So the most important philosopher in animal rights is Tom Regan, who passed away a few years ago. He's a philosophy professor at North Carolina State University, and he wrote a book at Rights of Animals in 1983, so a little bit after Singer's book came out. And we'll see, very critical of Singer, even though really in many respects they argue a lot of the same things. He's very critical of Singer. And what Regan argues is that an animal is a subject of a life, which means that for every individual animal, they want to preserve their own life, whether it's through rational thought or instinct, and I think now science is showing, and maybe a little more rational thought than people thought in the past, but either way, it doesn't matter. Animals want to preserve their own life, their own comfort. That matters, which means that animals aren't instrumental, they're inherent. So an animal is inherent in its view. And without getting too much into philosophical weeds, Regan is a Kantian, a follower of Immanuel Kant, although Kant didn't believe in any rights or justice for animals. In fact, he allowed some examples of cruelty. So he kind of reconstructs Kant to be someone who would support animals. What's important here is what separates him and this whole umbrella of animal rights from the welfarists and people like Singer is that he's a deontologist, not a consequentialist. So whereas the consequentialists, like the utilitarians, looked at results, for Regan, what matters is this a priori idea that animals matter. Their rights to exist are inherent, and nothing can change that. There's no results, no matter what the results are, even if it means, the furthering of the human society, for years to come. It doesn't matter because we don't sacrifice the rights of one for the many. And so he critiques Singer, not just for Singer, the outcome of Singer, the idea that Singer isn't as uniform in not allowing certain actions against animals, but again, he criticizes them from sort of this fundamental basis as to what it is that you're doing as a philosopher. And for Regan, it's not the results that matter. As an ethical issue, you start from this idea that animals are a subject of life. And therefore, humans can't use animals at all. Can't eat them, can't wear them, can't use them for research under any circumstance. Whatever the benefits might be for the research, it doesn't matter. Just like we wouldn't use another human for scientific research, you don't use them you don't use animals for scientific research. There's a lot of animal rights in legal scholarship, and this is more about how the law should not consider animals to be property. So Gary Francione is a law professor at Rutgers. There's on the right. He makes this point, what he sees as our moral schizophrenia towards animals. So he argues where people were very upset about, for example, Michael Vick, or a local story about mistreating of a dog or a cat. Yet at the same time, these people will go home and eat a hamburger, not realizing that the same, or maybe even realizing it, horrors about what Michael Vick did to these dogs are being inflicted upon the cows that are comprising the hamburger. Stephen Wise has been more relevant lately. He focuses more on higher functioning mammals, and he believes that mammals should have legal personhood, that they should have some level of recognition in the law that prevents them from being kept by humans, that they should lead the life that they're meant to lead. One other important philosopher is Susan Donaldson and Will Kimlicka, who are Canadian philosophers. And I'm going to talk a lot about them, and actually going to talk about them, as we get to the end of the presentation a little bit. They don't just focus on negative freedom, they also focus on positive freedom. So let me explain the difference between negative and positive freedom. Negative freedom is what we usually think about when we think about freedom. So it's the idea that the government can't do something to me. As I have a freedom, the government or a corporation or another person can't harm me. So if you think about freedom of speech, that means I can say whatever I want and I can't be punished for it. It's a kind of conflictual relationship between me as an individual and the government. Positive freedom, however, focuses on freedoms and responsibilities and the duties that the government has to make things better for somebody. So I think a good way of thinking it, kind of going outside animals for a minute, if you think, for example, about the Civil Rights Act in 1964, that's a perfect example of negative freedom, where African Americans and other racial ethnic minorities and women are being mistreated. They're being denied service. They're being denied jobs or promotions. So things that are happening to them that are bad because of their race or gender. And now the law says you can't do that anymore. You can't inflict these kinds of negative things on these people. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is an example of negative freedom. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, on the other hand, would be an example of positive freedom, where this law says that now the government or private organizations or any level of government, federal down to states, universities, are required to make their facilities so that people with disabilities can access them. And so that's an example of positive freedom. And Donaldson and Kimlicka are arguing that it's not just so much negative freedom, what we can't do to animals, but what we as humans, what responsibilities we owe to animals. And so they're not really abolitionists. They don't focus as much on like Regan, who focuses on what we can't do to animals. They focus on what we should do for animals. And for them, the idea is that it depends on the type of animal. So they look at three types of animals. Domestic animals, which are talked mainly about, and I'm going to bring this back up a couple more times, which are companion animals or therapy animals, farm animals as well, but more thinking about in this context, the companion and therapy animals. Domestic animals we should think of them as citizens. Now, obviously, it's not the same kind of citizenship. They don't vote. They don't, that kind of citizenship. But the idea is that as citizens, as people, or as beings in a shared community, they should be treated with sort of fundamental right to ensure that their needs are being met, just like any other citizen. I'm going to talk a little more about this, but the idea that they have a certain kind of agency. As citizens, you have agency. You can vote to control your own circumstances, or you can exercise other political actions to control your own circumstances. They argue the same should be done with domestic animals. And we'll say this is very important when we get to therapy animals. Liminal animals, these are animals that live with humans, but we don't exactly call them companion or domesticated, but they're not wild animals. So for example, squirrels, pigeons, they're like denizens, like migrants into the human community, and we should treat them as such. And then they view wildlife as sovereign. So our relationship with wildlife would be somewhat akin to like the relationship between two sovereign nations. Donaldson and Kimlicka are one of the few that actually focus on therapy animals. And a little bit, I'm going to kind of read a quote from them in some areas where I think they're mistaken. They do believe in narrow circumstances that therapy animals can be permitted if it's enjoyable for the animals, if the animals are treated as citizens. Again, this concept that their agency matters as much as our agency in those circumstances. As long as we avoid what they call adaptive preferences, which would be brainwashing, meaning training in animals so that they think that they're enjoying an activity when in fact it's really not natural for them. And we control working conditions, not so much in the way that some of the institutions I talked about before, but similar kind of how labor rights work with humans, kind of a collective bargaining, although of course animals are not in the position of bargain, and I'll focus on that in a little more when I get into some of the specifics in my conclusion. Finally, there's the most kind of radical, which is the critical animal studies movement. This is a critical theory. Critical theory is from the Frankfurt School, which is Germany, 1920s, in between the two wars. And it's kind of a post-Marxist critique of modernity, where the idea of that more technology will lead to more progress. The critical theorists have argued that that doesn't work out very well, that technology and progress have actually been harmful to humanity, and it's really just benefited dominant classes, whether it be the corporate class, which would be like Marx, but also they focus on things like race, gender, and other areas. And then when Nazi Germany came into effect, many of the critical Frankfurt School members like Marcuse and Adorno and Horkheimer were Jewish and fled Nazi Germany, came to the United States or other parts of Europe, and basically founded this idea that philosophy really only matters is emancipate the oppressed. And it's been applied to all sorts of postmodern theories. It's been applied to art and literary criticism, film criticism, architecture, politics, international relations. It's not until the new millennium where it's applied to animals. And the critical animal studies view sees the animal industrial complex as something that exploits animals for profit. They argue that the human animal studies field, which includes HAI, is complicit. They even go after animal rights supporters. They don't like Gary Francione because they don't see him as being willing to undermine the system. So for critical animal studies, the idea is that you can't just say animals should have rights or better treatment. You have to undermine the global capitalist system that exploits animals. That's the only way to free animals, and you do that by aligning with other liberation movements, race, class, gender, sexuality. Some members of critical animal studies, and I'll talk about this a bit, even support criminal activities to liberate animals, and I'll get into that in a section. So what are briefly some of the animal rights political activities, many of which I'm sure you in your professional or academic life have confronted. Probably most well known is the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA. It's probably the leading animal rights group. It sponsors protests. It began by using covert operations with hidden videos of how animals are treated in research laboratories and agricultural facilities. They're known for their outlandish publicity stunts. So here's a stunt they had where they had models in the nude saying they'd rather go naked than wear fur. The idea of how bad fur is. Interestingly, the critical animal studies people have critiqued this campaign because on the one hand, maybe it might be good for animals, but clearly it objectifies women. And so if we're going to build bridges as animal advocates with other oppressed groups, then why would you then do something that would undermine women? The Non-Human Rights Project, which is founded by Stephen Wise, has used the courts to establish, or is trying to use the courts, I should say, to establish legal rights for chimpanzees. I was actually a member of it, giving a kind of social science consultant when they were planning their case. And they picked the state of New York using common law to establish legal personhood for animals. They haven't been successful in court, but they have managed to garner considerable publicity and I think sort of change the national conversation about how we treat higher functioning mammals. There was an HBO documentary about him. There's been several major stories about their work. There are also radical groups, the Animal Liberation Front, which is here. They will break the law to free animals. The Animal Rights Militia was an offshoot of that, where they actually will not just break the law, but engage in violence. They will harm people that they believe are mistreating animals. There are numbers here as well, but I'm kind of running low on time, and if anyone has any questions on this, I'll be happy to answer them as well. So what about animal rights and animal-assisted therapy? And first thing I would argue is, there's no question that there are conflicts. And especially they exist in some of the more radical and vocal animal rights groups like PETA. And I believe a lot of this comes from misconceptions. So I talked a little bit about Donaldson and Kimlicka, and I think actually their model, as I'm going to explain at the end, is useful for kind of building bridges and mediating conflicts between animal rights and AAT where they exist. But even they engage in misperceptions. So I'm going to read from what they said about animal-assisted therapy in their book. They said, viewed in this light, much training of domesticated animals is exploitive. Most therapy and assistance animals are not trained to develop their own potential interests, but molded to serve human ends. The same goes for horse riding animals in the entertainment industry and most other kinds of animal work. And what's interesting about this is their book is a very well-cited book. It is, well, it's theoretical and philosophical. It is very empirically sound, except for that. So all of the research that I encountered about how animals are treated in the therapy field, for the most part, I mean, obviously there are exceptions, but for the most part, research I found is that in fact they're not right. Their perception is they're taking the worst cases and conflating them to what would be, what they're seeing as the norm. And again, what's interesting here is they have no citations to back up that statement. And I think maybe if they had engaged in a little more of that research, they might have come to a different conclusion. So I would argue that animal rights and animal-assisted therapy can coexist. Now, again, it depends on the animal rights perspective. It also depends on the types and sources of the animals. So again, there are certain animals that are just not appropriate for human contact, and they should not be used in this respect. Also, the sources matter. So one of the things that many animal rights groups oppose is breeding. The idea that animals are bred instrumentally for human use. And that's an area where there maybe the conflicts might not exist, maybe can't be resolved. But if there are ways to use therapy without breeding animals, I think that's something that can lead to coexist. And I think the framing and terminology matters too. I think when in any context, in a therapy context or a companion context, where somebody thinks of the animal as their property, as something they own, and they speak about the animal as their property, then I think that can create a negative impression for animal rights philosophers and activists when it's their guardian, their trustee as a guardian. So for example, our companion animal that we rescued as a puppy, I don't say I own her. I don't say I'm her owner, I'm her guardian. My wife and I are her guardian, not her owner. And I think when that kind of terminology is used, I think then there's more likelihood that animal rights and animal-assisted therapy can coexist. So kind of summing up, kind of going forward, sort of where I see kind of this going as we go through, I think for the animal rights activists, I think that many are flexible and willing to listen. I think some of them are, and I'll talk about this in a minute, I think some are not, but I think many are. And I'll talk a little bit about my experience as an advisor to the student animal rights group on campus and how I see where there is some flexibility and willing to listen. I think they should correct some of the misperceptions of AAT and how animals are treated. For example, the passage I read in the Donaldson and Kimlicka book, I think while I very much agree with a lot of their argument, I do think that that's one of the shortcomings there, and perhaps more research on their part and might have led to a different conclusion. It might not have, but at least there could have been citations, and I think that could have been, their point could be taken more seriously. I think they should incorporate, like I said, incorporate that extant literature and largely approach their passion with more respect and understanding. So one of the things I tell my students, again, like I said, I'm the faculty advisor to the animal rights group here on campus, and a lot of them are students, they're young, they're very passionate, especially about something like this. But I try to explain to them, it's one thing, to devote your time and effort, in some cases scholarly analysis. I've done honors thesis, I've and even dissertations I've supervised that have dealt with this issue. And I think that's great, and I encourage that. I said, but it's another thing if you're going to act in a way where you're not really going to do anything on behalf of animals, but you're going to do something where you make yourself feel morally superior to someone else. So when they're going to have a protest, and so for example, they have a protest here on campus in Halloween time called Spooky Houses. It's right outside our campus, El Pollo Loco, and it shows what life is like for a chicken in the, processing plants that make up the chickens in El Pollo Loco. And I think that's great. And it's shocking and it's jarring, and I think that's great. But when they talk to people, and they are going to get people coming up to them, some of them maybe not so nicely, but what I try to explain to them is, don't make those people feel like they're inferior for eating animals or working with animals or whatever the kind of approach they have, whatever their interaction is with animals, because that's just might make you feel better, but it's also harden their position, and you're not going to actually do anything for the animals. So I think that's important for the animal rights activists. For the AAT professionals, I think one of the things that you all could do is complement the evidence-based approach with a deeper understanding of the philosophical underpinnings, which again was the purpose of this presentation. Again, I'm not saying abandon evidence-based approaches. I'm an empiricist myself. I am a big believer in evidence-based science and acting on evidence. And that's very important. It's fundamental as a way to approach the world, not just as a scholar, but just as a human being or any citizen. But I do think it's important to understand what these deeper philosophical underpinnings are with animal rights and animal welfare. And I think having that understanding can maybe help you better engage with some of the people who might, be in conflict with what you're doing or raise concerns about what you're doing, about violating the rights of the animals. But if you understand these terminology that they're using and where they're coming from philosophically, I don't mean, that doesn't mean you stop what you're doing, but I think it can help kind of mediate or de-escalate their conflicts. I think it's important to understand that animal rights is not a monolithic view. Not every animal rights person is PETA. I consider myself an animal rights person. I don't eat animals or I'm completely against personally any use for animals, but I also disapprove largely of the way PETA carries its business, and I address some of that in my book. And so it's important to understand that not every animal rights person is PETA or the Animal Liberation Front. And that not all activists are out to undermine your profession. I think that's important to understand that many of us, applaud what you do, and it's just a way of thinking about the relationship you have with the animals with whom you work. Also, on the research, on this evidence-based research, I think Lori Marino in our 2012 piece pointed out that there are limitations on the research. And so I think engaging in more of that research on what are the actual effects, and I found some of the research I came across, I found fascinating. I'm not a physical scientist, so maybe a little bit was some of the chemistry might have been out of my league, but I found a lot of it to be very fascinating. And I think more of that kind of research can lead to a better understanding, on the ground as a consequentialist measure of how those animals are being treated and, what's happening to them when they're in these different kind of therapy experiences. And so finally, kind of as a sort of ending point, I like this idea for AAT that animals are citizens. And again, citizens do jobs for other people. I'm a citizen, I'm an employee of the university, I'm an employee of the state of Florida. I do stuff for other people, but I'm still a citizen. So I'm not arguing that animals shouldn't be engaged in therapy. My point is that they can be seen more as citizens. And that's a Donaldson and Kimlicka article. And I encourage everyone, if you have a chance, to read the book. And I say this notwithstanding some of their misperceptions of AAT, but I think it can provide a useful understanding of the animals' roles The idea is that the animals are not instrumental, while yes, they're helping humans, but that it's a reciprocal relation. The animals are getting something out of it too. And this idea that it's a shared community, that the animal, the handler, the patient, the therapist are all in something together that will benefit all four parties. And the idea that Chemical and Donaldson and Kimball talk about dependent agency, that obviously animals don't vote, they don't lobby, they don't speak English, they communicate, but understanding their communication. And so if something is not going well in the therapy, to understand and pay very close attention, as many of you I know do, to what the animal's feeling. I'm going to explore what they call expressing the subjective good. And I like the analogy to the human labor rights movement, notwithstanding obviously some of the corruption of labor unions, but just this idea, obviously animals can't collectively bargain like in our faculty union. We have a bargain, collective bargaining agreement. Obviously, I'm not calling for something like that, but I think something where maybe some of the advocates for animals and AAT professionals can get together and then have something like a collective bargaining agreement where, again, the two parties are considered equals. So anyway, I thank you all for attending the presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions or discuss any